Welcome to the Behavioral Health and Performance Red Risk School. It's certainly been an exciting week for the U.S. space program as we return to launching our astronauts to the ISS from U.S. soil with our technologies. I think in that context, we're going to have a great set of discussions as part of this program. My name is Jeff Willey, Associate Professor of Radiation Oncology at Wake Forest School of Medicine and Director of this program. Now, the Red Risk Schools are sets of discussions with content experts who detail the high priority risks to human health and space as described as part of the Human Research Program's roadmap, specifically the Integrated Path to Risk Reduction. And those high priority risks are identified by the color red. I would advise any of you who are interested in performing work, research, and just general knowledge to go to the HRP's website to take a look at that. Our focus this week will be risks to astronaut behavioral health and performance. And we have a great program. We're going to be talking about the risks from a number of different perspectives, an overview of the risk. Operational side, we have the astronaut's perspective, talking about it from an entrepreneurship perspective. So please stay around for the talks this week. I think they're going to be really informative. The Red Risk School is sponsored by the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, or TRISH, who partners with the Human Research Program to fund and study many of these risks, as well as to mitigate some of these risks using technologies that have advantages both in space and on the ground. If you have a technology you think could be applied to improving human health in space, but also on Earth, TRISH has a current call for proposals that may support your technology. So check them out on their website. So with that, let's start this week's program. For the audience, if you have questions, please use the question and answer Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll address those to the presenters at the end of the presentations. So with that, it brings me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tom Williams. Dr. Williams is the element scientist for human factors and behavioral performance as part of the Human Research Program at NASA's JSC. He has previously served as director of the Behavioral Health and Performance Laboratory at JSC. As a clinical psychologist, he has held many leadership positions in both NASA and the Department of Defense, focusing on health policy and maintaining the psychological and physical health of astronauts and our warfighters. And these include serving as the supervisory professor and director in senior leader development and resiliency at the U.S. Army War College, director of the U.S. Army Physical Fitness Research Institute, chief of psychology at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, among many other leadership positions. So today he's going to be starting off our week giving us an overview of the human factors and behavioral performance element and associated risks. So with that, Dr. Williams.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks to you and your team for working to help set this up and for the entire week that will help give perspective. My apologies for those, and my camera will not interface with the WebEx, so we're going to have to just say next slide. So we know as we get ready to strive to send human missions to Mars, and that's the primary focus of the Human Research Program, we're going to encounter all sorts of unprecedented technological and human endurance challenges. And we're going to do so in a way that's going to necessitate that there's increasing autonomy in the crew as they increasingly become Earth independent. So this just kind of shows us the end state that we're all striving to, and we will address it in the context of this as we go forward with this briefing. Next slide, please. We're increasingly looking to try to take advantage of going to the moon, so we want to use the moon as truly an advanced analog setting where we know we're going to be having opportunities for 1/6 gravity, potential habitation, and then also some exposures to the isolation and confined areas. So we really look at the upcoming opportunities for the moon as really a stepping stone to get us to Mars and an important stepping stone. So we're now looking to how to take advantage of this opportunity. Next slide. So when we think ahead, dream big, reach high, we're exploration bound. Next slide. The Human Research Program is really focused on what are all these physiological, environmental, psychosocial challenges that we're likely to encounter. How might health and performance experience decrements as we try to engage in this exploration mission? And how do we identify what the effective mitigation strategies will be? That's what the goal of the Human Research Program is, and we're an element within the Human Research Program focused on behavioral health and performance and the human factors related to achieving this mission. Next slide. So when we think about the Human Research Program writ large and what we do within the context of that program, we're looking for basic applied operational research that addresses those risks, and we're doing so in the context of the health, how physiological changes may impact on the cognitive performance or the risk factors related to long-duration spaceflight, and how those habitability standards may impact. So we try to design out some of the risk, and then we identify what are the countermeasures and other risk mitigation solutions that we can bring to bear to include what type of technologies or habitability designs may mitigate some of the risk. And we'll address those as we go forward. Next slide. So when we think about the 5 primary hazards to the human system, and if you watched the launch over the weekend, you got to see a couple of those in play all at once. The altered gravity, of course, the little dragon that floated as soon as they were in low Earth orbit. So we know that gravity, radiation, distance from Earth, isolation, hostile closed environment, these are all the risks that we see are posed to a human in space. Next slide. And when we drill down, you'll see each of those blue arrows focused on, although we focused on isolation predominantly, we see embedded within each of those risks threats to behavioral performance and human factors. So we have to be attentive to all 5 spaceflight hazards. We can't just focus on kind of the isolation, the psychological effects of being isolated from friends and family and from Earth. Next slide. So you heard Jeff refer to the red risk, and we've got the blue purplish arrow pointing to what we're going to be focused primarily on today, although I will address some of the other risks within our element, but we'll primarily focus on cognitive behavioral conditions. So you can see the red line goes all the way out to about 2026, where we start to feel like we'll have countermeasures developed and validated to address and mitigate these risks. Next slide. So I always like to anchor us. We talked about the 5 hazards, but we got to remember the crew members in the middle of that. So it's not just this abstract thing that we're working toward, but it actually is the crew. That's first and foremost why we're trying to do what we do. So go ahead and just build until we have all 5 hazards. You just go about 5 more slides. So you can see we just addressed each of those areas, the altered gravity, distance from Earth, hostile closed environment, isolation and confinement. Now, next slide. And we've got to think about these in the context so that we're not surprised. The old black swan event, something that in retrospect we should have understood was likely to be there. Its impact is extreme enough that it may cause a risk to the mission. So we really need to understand that human experiences all of these spaceflight hazards in combination, simultaneously in most cases. Some start out earlier than others, but we really do need to understand them in the context of the human that's centered and receiving these experiencing these spaceflight hazards. Next slide. So if you look down the middle, kind of the radiation, distance from Earth, isolation and confinement, you'll see most of the work that is going on in the Human Research Program that is the red risk will fall into those 3 main categories. And you'll see some of the other hazards have red risk as well, probably difficult to read, but predominantly the three big red ones are down that center, and that's, again, we'll hit on each of those as we go through today's discussion. Next slide. So when we think about just the current and exploration class missions, there's a lot of great countermeasures that the Behavioral Health and Performance team has put together to help address a lot of the current risk with low Earth orbit. As we move to exploration class in that center column there, as we go to deep space where there's no resupply, more Earth-independent operations with limited confinement, limited volume that increases the sense of confinement, we see the major challenges arrayed down below: stress, conflict, mood, morale, sleep. It increasingly makes it important to ensure we understand what's the right crew to put together, or to at least identify what are the characteristics that are going to thrive in those type of environments, and then what are the adaptation and training that's needed? How do we identify the growth and resiliency that can come about from experiences like that? How do we maintain that family connectedness? How do we take into account the reduced volume and how that may impact on sensory stimulation? And as they increasingly become in a position where Earth can't be seen, you can see in the picture looking up on the left, in this 15,000 square foot International Space Station, looking at the cupola is one of the major stress relievers. It's something that you see increasingly crew drawn to. So it tells us that's a coping, a reward, a sense of fulfillment that they get from that. So we have to take all of these factors into consideration and look at how to reduce the risk. Next slide. So as we think about the risk, really it's important for us as the element to think about, well, what are the factors that are going to impact on that risk? What's the time frame that they may start to impinge on it? What's the likelihood they're going to occur? What's the consequence if they do occur? How much uncertainty do we have about the impact? And what's the mechanism or phenomenon that's going to activate these or to potentially integrate them with others? Next slide. So we also have to think about when we're trying to mitigate the risk, we're going to mitigate that adverse outcome. Are we going to look to change a requirement? Are we going to try to introduce a technology that may reduce it? Is there a countermeasure that would help us in some way to reduce or mitigate that risk? Do we change a clinical practice guideline so we provide more intervention earlier or a more refined intervention later to reduce the risk? What are the tools that we might use? What models might we bring into play to help mitigate this risk? So we have to think about whenever we're going out with a solicitation or getting research being proposed to us, we're trying to align that to one of these 6 categories. Next slide. So when we think about, we're not trying to find the perfect solution, we're trying to find the one that's acceptable, that we understand the risk is acceptable to the extreme risk that may be there. So we're trying to balance out risk and opportunity and to create the opportunity for decision makers to better understand how to weigh that risk. And so we need to look at what are the fitness for duty standards that are related in the NASA Standard 3001. What are the permissible outcome limits for the changes in health outcomes? What are the permissible exposure limits to manage the risk, the levels of care that might guide the capabilities that we would provide? And can we design some of these risks out by looking at the human factors or habitability or altering the environment in some way that would mitigate that risk? Next slide. So importantly, for this particular risk, we had our team look at all 664 standards that are in 3001. And for the behavioral medicine risk, we identified there are 291 standards, 21 of which have a direct adverse impact if science is not considered. 63 will have an indirect adverse impact. So it may not be an immediate impact, but over time, if we don't attend to the science of the behavioral medicine risk research that we're delivering, there could be an indirect adverse impact, and 207 have the potential to adversely impact on the crew member if the standard is changed, and we want to monitor that. We want to understand. And then we had our teams go through and look at a behavioral health index factor and a human factors index. So we have two elements that were brought together several years ago, about 5 years ago now, the behavioral health and performance and the human factors. And we wanted to take a look at every one of those standards and relate it using Bradford Hill science criteria and the level of research evidence in the behavioral health and performance side or the human factors. Because remember, the human factors will try to design out some of the risk. Behavioral health and performance alerts us to how the risk may be manifest and impact on the cognitive or behavioral abilities of the crew member to carry out the task. So we needed a good understanding of what's the level of design features that may help us mitigate some of that risk, and what's the risk in general. And again, using science criteria to address that. And we'll come back to this later in the presentation. Next slide. So when we think about the behavioral medicine risk, it's the risk of an adverse cognitive or behavioral condition and psychiatric disorder. So the risk statement is when we're on an extended duration mission and we're isolated, confined in some extreme environment, then there's a possibility that an adverse cognitive or behavioral condition will occur that's going to impact on some aspect of crew health and performance, and a mental disorder could develop should adverse conditions be undetected and unmitigated. So that implies that we need to try to prevent this. We don't want it to move to a level where there's a diagnosable disorder that now has to be treated. We're really focused on mitigating the risk before it ever would get to that point. And we'll put some of that in context later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So here's a quick rundown. I'm going to go through these quick because I'm going to come in more detail, but this will just kind of give you a concept. So our BMed-1 gap, so these are the gaps in knowledge that we believe we have that need to be addressed. So we need to really understand what are the key selection factors for astronauts that relate to the cognitive behavioral strengths. BMed gap 2, as we expose them to these spaceflight hazards, how do we identify who's more susceptible, or how do we monitor when changes are starting to take hold, and then validate the performance measures that may change? And again, how do we make that acceptable so that as we're monitoring performance, that's alerting us to potential alterations that may manifest into a later, bigger problem? BMed gap 3, once we've identified that, how do we then determine what are the treatments, interventions that we may have to provide in order to get that addressed? And then BMed 4, as we look at this, these forces, stressors that are coming together, how do we make sure that we can try to design the habitat or vehicle to mitigate some of those to reduce the risk? And that's kind of the human factors design that part out, altering the habitat in some way. And we'll address some of that as we go through as well. And then BMed 5, what are the medical or dietary countermeasures that we might be able to bring to bear? Next slide. And then BMed 6, maintaining the personal relations and interactions with family, friends, and colleagues to mitigate those risks of stress. And then BMed 7 are the long-term changes that may come about as a result of a mission. So how do we leverage the fact that astronauts will receive extensive assessments once they return that may help inform us about modifications or changes that we could make to reduce the risk for future missions? So how do we take advantage of the astronauts that have already been on like short-term and then longer duration missions, and then harvest that information to reduce overall risk? And then BMed 8 kind of goes to that black swan event. Crew members are going to experience all these spaceflight hazards, the 5 that we talked about, simultaneously. So we tend to do our research in nice research lanes. How do we make sure that we haven't missed something, that there's not a potential synergistic impact of multiple stressors coming together and then a disproportionate response accruing that was outside what we anticipated with any one of our previous risks? So it's important that we take a look at that and not in retrospect realize, gee, since the crew was experiencing everything all at once, we should have looked at the research to characterize that risk. Next slide. So when we look more specifically at BMED1, validating those key selection factors, I think there had 12,000 applications in the most recent selection process that are currently being worked through. Next slide. I thought it might be interesting just to take a look back. The Space Task Group back in 1958 that was charged with trying to determine, well, who should we select for this first crew of astronauts that were depicted on the previous slide. Here were the 4 big categories. They knew they needed to do some kind of sequence monitoring. They were going to monitor all the critical phases of the space mission. They had to manage the systems that were on board. They had to maneuver the vehicle to maintain that proper relationship. And then they had to carry out special activities that were related to the research and evaluation to determine what was going to happen to humans as a result of flight conditions. And if you think about those and think about the launch that just occurred over the weekend, we're still doing some of the basic foundational things that were so important and identified back in 1958. Next slide. And just to reinforce that even more, just thinking about the 2 crew members that went up, part of what we're looking at then and still looking at today, how much capacity do they have to endure the environmental stresses that they're going to encounter? How tough are they? You would hear reports about the backgrounds of the astronauts. How resilient are they? What are their motor skills like? You may have seen the crew sitting there before the launch, moving their fingers. So part of that is related to crew time on back, how long had they been on their back, how their fingers started tingling, and they wanted to make sure they had the manual dexterity for the touch screens. Perceptual skills, being alert, being vigilant. How does that change when you're on your back for a couple of hours pre-launch? And they had duties that were analyzed. They had to survive, demonstrate the ability to fly, perform, and then serve. What if there's automatic controls that don't work? And you remember the current crew they took the automatic controls off and took it for a test drive, as they said. They also were making observations, and they were the true test pilots to improve the flight systems, make sure the components of the next flight, some of the bugs are worked out. So we see, even back in 1958, some of the foundational things continue today in terms of what we need in our astronauts and what we need to consider for selecting for. And you'll see variants of this as we talk through some of the other risks. Next slide, please. So we have to identify who are the resilient ones who can handle some of these things. Are there particular vulnerabilities that may risk? So that's part of when we go through assessment and selection of potential astronaut candidates. What are those risks for the conditions that may be posed to that? Are there individual susceptibilities to those threats? Are there personality, early life events that may create an increased risk? Is there a stress resilience profile? Can we look at monitoring how everything is working together to get a good assessment of what the risk is? Next slide. So as we go to BMED2, this is related to understanding that potential individual susceptibility and how do we determine how performance changes may alert us to those. Next slide. So we've all heard the reports. There was hostile, irritable, downright grumpy group that was on Skylab 4. Next slide. We've known about the Soyuz hallucinations were reported. Depression may have contributed to the evacuation of Soyuz in 1985. And then 2 out of 7 of the NASA Shuttle Mir astronauts reported depressive symptoms. This doesn't mean that they were depressed, but they were reporting symptoms consistent with a depressive episode. Next slide. So we see that there are individual variations on how they adapt. It can be related to personality, to motivation, how they process the information that they're encountering. how they interact with the groups, the psychosocial factors, if they're getting along, if they're having conflict, how do we reduce that? How do we decrease the risk of psychological problems if you're feeling the odd person out? Just think of 2001: A Space Odyssey and how the crew and Hal start not trusting each other, and how that starts to lead to difficulties later on. And then environmental, the social, organizational. How do we find meaningfulness in the work they have to do? How do we keep high-achieving individuals intellectually challenged so they don't become bored? Because you saw the crew sometimes sitting there with not much to do in a completely autonomous system. If you're in there for 7 months like that, how do you avoid that boredom, monotony? And then how do you design the vehicle to ensure that there's a harmonious group living, the privacy, the sleep areas, the social interactions, the ability to eat together like we see on ISS. Next slide, please. So we've got to be able to look across the settings, look across the missions, look across the disciplines to characterize where is the risk, and recognize that once you are on a mission, there is sort of a space normal. You're going to be altered by gravity, the way you feel, the way you process information may be altered. So you need to be able to understand this in the context of what's normal in an altered gravity environment. And how do we define the countermeasures that need to be delivered, and how do we tailor them in a personalized way, kind of using the concept of precision medicine to address the individual characteristics and not just one-size-fits-all type of intervention. And then how do we identify what are the psychosocial vital signs that we need to attend to? How do we be sure that the individual is not changing in some way that may increase the risk to the mission? Next slide. So one of the ways we went after the vital signs is to establish with David Dinges and his team a set of behavioral core measures, and we used them as a foundation to now move into what we're calling an exploration measures to standardize the way we're assessing the cognitive abilities, kind of the perceptual processing that you might get from robot, the visual spatial task journals, and then team questionnaires. So we'll talk about variants of each of these as we move forward. Next slide, please. So a slide credit Matthias Basner on this, and a great representation when looking across the 32 risks that the Human Research Program has. At least 25 of those risks identify cognitive performance in one way or another being impacted by those risks. So ICP, intracranial pressure, the noise, the nutrition, increased amounts of CO2, decreased amounts of oxygen, monotony, confinement, the non-24-hour light-dark cycles, workload, slam shifts, medication, radiation, microgravity, all can impact on cognitive performance in one way or another. And we need to be alert to these potential changes. First of all, identifying what we just talked about, what's space normal. So you're always going to be in an environment, an extreme environment. What does the typical person look like in that? That doesn't mean that they're abnormal. That just means that they're adapting to that environment. How do we sort out the adapted to this extreme environment to now you're operating in an abnormal way that needs to be mitigated in some way? Next slide. So when we think about assessing that cognitive ability that we saw potentially being impacted by any one of 25 risks that we're going to encounter, the team at UPenn, led by Matthias Basner and David Dinges and his team working with them, developed for us a cognition neurobehavioral test battery that assesses multiple areas we know are important for behavioral health and performance. Sensory motor ability, visual object learning and memory, attention, working memory, the ability to abstract, spatial orientation, read emotions, abstract reasoning, complex scanning, risk decision-making, vigilant attention, and importantly, we can map those into the regions of the brain that are being potentially activated when you're taking that test, so that we see we've established a normative base for the crew member. You're doing the testing, and we start to see decrements that alerts us to potential problem areas in the integration of regions of the brain. So we start to look for brain performance pathways, mapping that into mood changes, into other risks that the crew member may have encountered. And we'll address that more when we talk about an integrated risk. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about the resilient and adaptable person, we're also talking about it in the context of our other risk that's in our element, the team risk. So we have to make sure that when you're not being as resilient and as adaptable as you can be in response to the stressors of isolation, confinement, and extreme environments, it may have an impact on the other members of the team, and it may impact on how well you're cooperating and coordinating activities or communicating, which can then undermine some of the psychosocial adaptation of both the team and the individuals within the team. So the team becomes more dysfunctional. That starts to put increased stress on individual members, and individual members may react to that differently and in a more vulnerable way. So it's important that we look at how these may come together, and we're doing that with one of our N-scores, which is a multiple line of effort research project that David Dinges is leading for us. Next slide, please. So as we look at this, part of that N-score is also focused on how are the intra and inter-individual differences going to manifest. So the same spaceflight conditions may not impact on each individual in the same way. So we need to understand that, and we're looking at it in three major psychosocial domains related to the National Institutes of Mental Health research domain criteria on units of analysis. And the three we're looking at are the positive valence, how much patience or tolerance, respect does someone have, the negative valence, how irritable or anger or rude do they get, and then the social, how affiliated they are. And what's neat about the research domain criteria is it looks at a research approach that starts with what's the genetic vulnerability, how might that be changed with regard to the molecular structure that alters the cellular workings, that alters the circuitry, that alters the physiology, that alters behavior, that manifests into some kind of social process change. And so how do we step down to see where's the change starting to occur? Because we do have some risk that will start to alter either the DNA or the molecular structure based on the insults to some of the brain tissue. So we need to start looking at that and better characterizing how the risk may be manifested later. Next slide. So we're trying to do this across multiple settings. We've got an animal model that's trying to map it in the animal equivalent to the duration of various missions that we would have. And we're doing that within Hera on the 45 days, in Neuenmeyer in Antarctica across 14 months, and in Icarus at UPenn looking at 8 days. So being able to crosswalk across different durations and taking the same measures across these multiple settings with different types of stressors helps us then better characterize what are the potential markers for adaptation, and resilience. Next slide. So part of the reason we need to understand this adaptation and resilience is you see on the right-hand side one of the Apollo astronauts climbing out of the lunar lander versus the left-hand side after a 6 to 7 month mission where a lot of help is needed. There will not be that help when we land on Mars. So how do we start to characterize the post-landing capabilities to determine how soon can a crew member recover from the prolonged exposure to altered gravity, and then what are the tasks that need to be done? Next slide. So we've put together a research project and already collected on 2 crew members to try to determine what is the operationally relevant performance that would need to be performed post-landing, and how capable is the crew member to carrying out that. So for example, if at post-landing they had to do a task within the first 24 hours, say, for example, to connect an electrical grid or something like that, then how capable is the crew member upon coming into a and now 1G environment instead of the 1/3 G that would be on Mars. But how do we assess what that potential capability would be? So one of the ways we're doing that is with robotic onboard trainer, and crew members receive about 100 hours of training on the robotic task before they go up, before they launch, and it really simulates kind of critical spaceflight maneuvers and capturing like resupply vehicles operating the Canadarm. Next slide. So we know with robot, we're getting good spatial visual orientation, visual processing, object orientation, mental rotation, fine motor skills, visual motor integration. If you look at that list, you'll see it's a great tool to give us an operational assessment of multiple systems being integrated to carry out a design task that is critical to the functioning of the crew. So it helps to put an operationally relevant task in there. Crew won't object to doing a robotic task like they would filling out surveys or carrying out, like doing cognition battery, for example. So this becomes important, and we increasingly are trying to identify operationally relevant tasks that we can assess to determine what's the status of the crew member as they're exposed to various stressors. Next slide. And that's just reinforcing the point I just made, the potential metrics. So next slide. So BMED 3, how do we identify treatments? And Nick Canis, great book on humans in space, and I think it's his chapter 8 that does a good review of some of the research related to some of the countermeasures and treatment approaches that have been used. Next slide. So we just talked about crew time on back a little bit, and I just want to highlight this. We've got this research project in the chutes right now. It's going out the door. And just thinking about the crew, their time on back that you just saw pre-launch, and look at the different areas that may be impacted, and how do we design approaches that prevent some operationally relevant performance decrement from occurring. And that's exactly the research that we're trying to do. We don't want to wait till a problem happens. We want to try to prevent it or reduce its impact in some way so that the crew member isn't fully impacted by the potential risk that is there. So looking at how might we look at the psychological ratings and the pressure and the pain and how to adapt operationally relevant performance and to set the true conditions for our research that helps reinforce and helps educate and then inform the flight surgeon about what's changing to help them then make appropriate and timely decisions. So this is an example of a countermeasure and an intervention before the problem starts to occur. Next slide. We also have a mental health checklist. Candace Alfano and her team at the University of Houston helped design for us a mental health checklist to look at how, when things are starting to go bad, how do we assess the nature of how they're changing? So regulation skills, positive adaptation, disillusionment, fatigue, lethargy, cognitive inflexibility, to give a sample of how these systems are being brought online. So sometimes individuals don't want to acknowledge that they're not feeling negative, but they might recognize that they're not feeling as positive. And maybe that change is enough to alert us to potential risk down the road. Next slide. So I'm going to just run through, hit a lot of these real quick. The standard measures we talked about, that's helping us identify what are the likely candidates. How do we determine when to provide an intervention? We got to know what's happening, what's our baseline. How might carbon dioxide alter some of that cognitive processing? And then what are the predictors of who's going to handle chronic stress more effectively than others? Next slide, please. And then once we do determine that something is problematic, how do we deliver an asynchronous behavioral health treatment? So you won't, because of time delays, they may not be able to reach directly back to behavioral health and ops, the operational psychologist, to help address the issue. So what are some systems that could be there to help manage that until they can make contact in an appropriate way. So we're looking at asynchronous treatments. Next slide. We tried a virtual reality system linked back to the family. Sometimes those work well, sometimes they don't. The family also has to be a participant. If you've got a lonely participant isolated and the family gets busy with the life challenges and they don't interface, that may create more tension than less. And that was one of the findings that we had on that. So sometimes that's important for us to know. And then astronaut journals, just kind of monitoring what's happening and monitoring the biomarkers, the changes. All of these help alert us to when an intervention may be needed, and then we have systems to help us address those. Next slide. So with the astronaut journals, monitoring the references that crew will make. So here we see problems adjusting and low morale, the various representations and how those change by different phases of the mission. So next slide. And here's some examples of what was related. I hesitate to use the word depression, but it seems an appropriate description of my mood lately. So what these reveal to us is that there are changes in mood and affect. Now, this doesn't mean that they're now at a diagnosable level, but that gives the benefit to the operational psychologist to now provide the intervention, to the discussion, to help mitigate this so that it does not manifest into something that may be problematic down the road. And there's no certainty that it would be. It just means that at this period of time, there was this feeling. So, but it alerts us, it's monitoring it and gives us an opportunity to provide an intervention. Next slide. And when we look across the entries, and this relates both to the BMed risk and the team risk, references to conflicts increase near the last quarter of the mission. So sometimes that might be related to the fact that crew members are getting excited and impatient about getting home, or it could be that their tolerance level has reduced over time. So it's just important that we try to understand which is it, and then it gives us appropriate venues to intervene. Next slide. And then positivity ratings go down. So conflict goes up, positivity goes down, so that alerts us again to the potential to add more interventions or asynchronous treatments near the final phase of a mission, potentially. Next slide. And then this is kind of a summary of all the different research that we're increasingly looking at is how do we identify the operationally relevant unobtrusive measures like robot? How do we identify, well, what are the performance metrics we should attend to? How do we identify what the individual and team predictors are so that when a crew is being assembled, it doesn't mean you couldn't pick an individual with these characteristics, but it would be important to know what is the composition, what's the increased risk, and that alerts the operational psychologists who are providing the interventions to then focus a little more if there's an indication that there may be more conflict on that team because of the skill sets that were needed, we had to adapt. And in multi-team systems, how do you integrate a commercial private crew and robotic system? How do we make sure that they all continue to operate effectively together? And then how does that change when there's a more autonomous mission with increasing comm delays? And how might that impact on the training that we give to the crew, MCC, and family when you're going to be, kind of not linked in a real-time manner? And then the countermeasures that need to be addressed. Next slide, please. So BMed 4, potentially negative associated changes, and how do we modify the habitat? Next slide. So you remember we talked about the standard. So next slide. One standard we had was standard 7.92, private crew quarters. For any mission greater than 30 days, individual private crew quarters shall be provided to support crew health and performance. You talk to crew, they all knew they wanted private crew quarters and missions longer than 30 days. The BHP ops, they knew based on observations that would make a big difference. But we didn't have any science to back them up. And that's important that we address this from a scientific perspective as well as from the anecdotal. So we wanted to provide support. So next slide. So one of the ways, and that's just an indication of when you're in a small, that's about the size of what the Orion vehicle would be. Next slide. I mean, the gateway. Next slide. We know that private crew quarters, here's just an example before they had private crew quarters, how close proximity you can be and how that looks kind of crowded and that may interfere with sleeping. Next slide. So what we did is we leveled a science requirement on the research operations integration, the old former ISSMP, to modify HERA. So our research analog, and you can see increased amounts of stowage bags. We took out the privacy that had been afforded in private sleeping quarters and put those cargo nets in the center picture there. You can see in the picture behind it how it used to be more private, now it's more open. And we reduced some of the volume to make the net habitable volume closer to what Gateway is likely to be. So those are steps that we can take on the science side to really try to create an increased fidelity to address the issues that will help address standards and make sure that we're supporting what we know is there. Next slide. We're also looking at net habitable volume with regard to the tasks that have to be performed. Next slide. And we're also looking at a major research project with 7 different PIs that we're trying to determine the execution support that is adaptive to what the crew is going to be asked to do and the decision support so that there can be a responsiveness when there's an increasingly Earth-independent operation and you don't have mission control. How do we develop intelligent systems to support the crew and the decisions they'll make? So this is part of that design out some of the risk by looking at the systems that are on board to reduce the risk to the crew when they're more autonomous. Next slide. So BMED 5, medical dietary countermeasures. And again, quote from the journals there, food assumes a huge impact when crew are together. And it always has in almost any mission where people are brought together under extreme conditions. Next slide. So again, it's important that we know what sort of person has a disease as much as it is to know the sort of the disease the person has. A nice quote from Hippocrates there. So everybody's affected. When you have a medical illness, you got psychological and behavioral factors that are going to be activated. And then sometimes the medical illness appears to be due, at least in part, to the psychological factors. So we really have to balance that out. Next slide. So we directed a task to our BHP lab to take a look at the 100 most likely spaceflight medical conditions that are to occur and then characterize what's the likelihood that a psychological symptom is related in some way to the presentation of that medical condition. So when you look at the medical condition, how many times is a psychological system likely to be activated? And they did it nicely aligned with the research domain criteria. You can see arousal, regulatory, sensory motor system, negative, positive valence systems, cognitive systems, social processes. And you can see a large number of medical conditions will have a symptom that is psychological in nature. So this will help us sort out, is it psychological, is it medical? And then the treatments, we also ask them to take a look at if you provide a treatment to the medical condition, how many side effects of the treatment are likely to manifest as a psychological symptom. So again, this is one of those, how do we get to what's really happening and make sure that we're not trying to psychologically treat an underlying medical condition or miss a medical condition because we've tried to address it as a psychological problem. Next slide, please. Smart Op is one of the ways that we address this in terms of providing a self-guided stress management resilience training. Next slide. Next slide. Go ahead and just build till the full slide comes up. There you go. So one of the things we know is happening is we're seeing white matter changes, microstructural changes that are occurring in the brain, and it tends to be in areas where visual spatial processing is occurring, vestibular function, and movement control. So this is part of our integrated research that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Because if you remember the robotic task and you got those visual spatial changes occurring as a result of space flight, or getting other macrostructural changes as a result of space flight. Next slide. And we're seeing changes in brain structure similarly in isolation and confinement analogs like NEK on a 520-day mission. It's alerting us to the changes in the brain that's due to the isolation and confinement and potential space flight. Next slide. And we see significant 3% in each of those red areas depicted down there right above Stan et al. So about 3% of those regions are decreasing as a result of the 14-month mission. So we're getting reductions in hippocampal volume of the dentate gyrus. Important areas as we're trying to understand how are people changing as a result of spaceflight. Next slide. Then we're seeing brain structural changes as a result of return from a 6 to 9 month mission on ISS. Next slide. So one of the things, and I'll end after I go through these to open it up for questions. So one of the things, given these changes, one of the approaches we're using is a solicitation we just sent out entitled Matrix, the Mars Adaptive Training Integrated Knowledge System, to look at how do we try to target training specifically to go after those regions that we're seeing being diminished by the lack of stimulation. Next slide. So go ahead. So if you remember in the movie The Matrix, where Neo turns to Trinity and says, "Can you fly that helicopter?" And she says, "Not yet." She calls back to Tank. Next slide. Tank downloads a program into Trinity's brain. Next slide. And then Trent, next slide. And then they go, that's her getting it downloaded. Then they go off and Trinity flies the helicopter. Sort of inspired by that Matrix. Next slide. So what we're trying to do is to identify what type of neuroscience-informed training can we target those specific areas of the brain that we've seen getting altered to then try to reactivate them with mission-relevant knowledge and skills. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. There's a couple of more. I apologize I didn't get to them all, but I'll stop there and open it up for questions out of respect for people's time. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. That's very informative. We have a couple questions to address here. We're going to start with this regarding cognitive countermeasures. In regards to cognitive countermeasures, is NASA focused on technological, drug, or psychological interventions?
I'd say primarily the psychological interventions, but because when you talk a drug, then you have to talk mass, weight, and volume, and you would have to try to anticipate how many drugs would you need to take, how soon would you deliver them, what kind of side effects, would there be underlying genetic vulnerabilities that you might not be as responsive to that drug, so we'd have to determine, because people's genetic predisposition they're not always going to metabolize a drug the same way. So we try to go for a more psychological approach that we find and that the crew member can take with them, or the crew physician that we would assume would be on a mission would be able to help provide, or we deliver it through autonomous systems, or the operational psychologist would deliver it. So we get more depth in the delivery of a psychological intervention than we could with the drug itself.
So with regard to asynchronous treatments, particularly for exploration class missions, is it planned that crew members receive training in terms of basic formal psychiatric assessment of mental state to improving situational awareness of subtle but potentially important changes in the mental state of colleagues in order to minimize potentially adverse outcomes?
That's certainly part of the training, and there's a mindfulness training to help them become more alert to the potential changes they're experiencing in themselves. So self-awareness is an important and critical component of that. They get feedback on the testing that they do, like cognition battery gives them an indication of their performance. They can get feedback on the operation of the robotic task, so they can be monitoring their own performance, but also crew are trained to monitor each other. Now, one of the things that we're looking at is when you have the cephalic shift and you have the sort of the facial edema, it's more difficult to read emotional expressions of other people because your facial expressions it takes more effort to be able to see if someone's angry or happy. So it sort of balances out. So we've got another research task looking at how does that facial edema change the ability to read the emotions of another person, because that's important for teamwork and important for getting interpersonal feedback to maintain your psychological health.
Along those lines, is it planned that crew members would receive training in the delivery of psychotherapeutic interventions, given the potentially limited pharmacotherapeutic interventions available in such circumstances?
Well, sort of like what the military does in kind of the buddy care, just part of being a crew member. You know what you're supposed to be doing. You know what your fellow crew member is supposed to be doing. So if you're seeing changes and you know the training you've received to help modulate some of the stressors, then the expectation would be, yes, they would help their crew members. And they do receive some training to that effect to be alert into the stressors that all may encounter.
Here's a question from an ex-MC intern. Given the emphasis on strong mental health, would pre-existing conditions of depression and anxiety count against an astronaut candidate?
Probably not necessarily. I think everything is put in context, and I think it's important to understand not every diagnosis is an accurate diagnosis. And certainly, as someone who has done assessments of individuals for high-risk missions, you always have to carefully understand what were the circumstances surrounding that, and it may have been a very normal reaction, like a grief reaction could get inappropriately diagnosed as a depressive episode, when in fact it's normal to be somewhat depressed for the 6 months following the loss of a loved one. So it's always important to put that in context, and so that I think it's a whole concept for selection. You don't look at any one thing that's going to eliminate you.
Tom, we have until 12:15 Central Time, but I want to respect your time here and just see if you have some time for a couple more questions.
Absolutely.
All right. I think it's a very important run. What role will AI play in mental health, especially probably assessment, treatment on long-term missions?
Well, AI is something that we're looking at. We recall the kind of the blue intelligence system slide that we had up. That really is intended to address some of that AI capability, and we have some PIs looking at that in terms of kind of the learning systems that can be applied, and kind of the machine learning in terms of determining when does the system need to provide the assist. So if we have an onboard system that's monitoring crew health and performance, and there's an emergency, like someone hits an alarm or a crew member is injured in some way, do we have lighting that would automatically become brighter as a result of an emergency alarm going off, so that the crew can then have increased vigilance and attention? And so we're looking at variants like that in terms of how do we design the habitat to make sure that it's responsive to what the individual crew member will need, but how do we then design intelligent systems that can assist the crew if they need to repair something, to help guide them in the way that mission control would have guided them in the past, but they can't because of the distance from Earth that they're going to be.
What would you say is the greatest cognitive effect of spaceflight? So, for instance, which domains are most affected?
Well, I think what we see, crew members will often report what they call a space fog. And so sometimes they'll report that their working memory tends to be impacted a little bit. And that's something that we certainly are attentive to. And we know that sometimes, and you have to sort out, sometimes because of a slam shift, a resupply vehicle coming in, so they're not getting the normal circadian kind of alignment, and that can alter their vigilance and attention. So those two domains where you got the kind of working memory, but also the visual spatial processing that we see is impacted by the isolation and confinement. And the way we kind of align what's most important is which ones are most operationally relevant for tasks that crew will have to perform. And we've also given another research task to our lab to go through and identify of the tasks that are defined or that are believed to be required by the crew, which of those tasks map into which brain domain pathways. And then we're trying to align that brain domain pathway to where is brain tissue most sensitive to isolation, confinement, to altered gravity, to some of the structural changes that we identified in some of the imaging from the brains that you saw, and then which of the brain tissue is most vulnerable. And we really didn't get to the interface between the radiation effects with the altered gravity effects and the stress effects, but we see that, and we've got a major integrated task underway to look at those three combined risks coming together to determine what are the brain domain pathways that are being impacted, and can we be alert to those potential changes that may relate to performance changes that are of relevance to mission required task. So that's where it really becomes important, is how does it map into brain domains that are linked into a performance that a crew member needs to do for the sake of the mission or their own health and fitness.
I think that brings up another important point, which I actually get asked a lot by collaborators, and that's kind of, for those doing ground-based studies, is it now become essential to not only study combined hazards, say if you're using a rodent model, but multiple combinations of hazards in which you might have simulated microgravity and radiation and altered CO2 and maybe isolation. What are your thoughts on that?
We increasingly, in our integrated risk, we are definitely going along the line of what you're saying. So we've got a major virtual N-score being led by Susanna Rossi at the University of San Francisco, with April Ronca at Ames and Larry Sanford at the Virginia Medical College, that all three are bringing together the integrated risks. So irradiation of the animals using a GCR SIM 5-ion, hind limb unloaded, so that we're getting some of the fluid shifts. So we're missing the neurovestibular changes that would also be associated with fluid shifts, but at least it gives us an indication of some of the changes that would be brought about, and then stress. So looking at that combination gives us an increased ability to better define what the crew member is more likely to experience. And then, because of the sacrifice of the animals, we're able to determine what are the areas of the brain that were most likely to be impacted. And then we've got computational modeling teams with Glenn that are looking at the previous research that looked at single ion being delivered at different doses with performance changes, and can we model, using a heuristic model, can we then model what a single ion produced compared to 5 ions with multiple risk, and how does that change, and then how does the brain tissue alterations that accounted for those performance changes, how was that altered by the introduction of the two additional stressors, if at all? So the null hypothesis has to be, it makes no difference. But we know that stress produces changes, we know that altered gravity does, and we know that radiation does. So is it an additive effect? Is there a potential antagonistic effect, or is it a synergistic, a disproportionate effect, so that when you put the three stressors together, you get a disproportionate elevation of the risk? And we certainly see that when you have LPS, which is a neuroinflammatory, injected into an animal that's already stressed, you get a much more pronounced reaction in the brain than you would have with either one of those alone. So a stressed animal getting another inflammatory introduced is much worse. And we know radiation produces an activation of microglia primarily because of the neuroinflammation. So to your point, we see it as really important as we move forward to not have a retrospective realization that we should have thought about the fact that the crew is experiencing all these risks simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you. What are your thoughts on how you might measure the effectiveness of an adaptive training simulation to serve as countermeasure to neurobiological changes due to isolation and confinement?
Well, can you ask that one more time? Because I thought I had it.
Sure. What are your thoughts on how you might measure the effectiveness of an adaptive training simulation to serve as a countermeasure to neurobiological changes due to isolation and confinement?
Yeah, that's what I thought the question was, because that goes to the heart of our matrix solicitation. So we are really trying to define how do we take advantage of the fact that on a 7 to 9 month mission, there's going to be training that crew will need to do. We also know from reports that crew often experience a lot of time demands pre-launch. So which of that training could we introduce part of and then provide additional training en route to Mars and provide that training in a format that actually stimulates areas of the brain that we know are impacted by isolation and confinement. So can we design training using simulations, using robotics on board, a simulator on board, that specifically will reactivate using kind of a sensory stimulation process the areas that are being diminished by the isolation and confinement? So that's exactly where we want to go. We know we're just at the edge of the technological capabilities to potentially bring that about. But if we don't start, we'll never get to that point. And we think there's enough evidence out there with the neuroscience of training now to give us the potential, at least in the motor strip, using an animal model that's already been demonstrated, where you can re-stimulate and reactivate that brain region. So how do we translate that to humans now and try to give back what isolation and confinement is taking away? Is there any thought to sending a married couple into space, looking in the future and how that might serve as a potential countermeasure for stress? That may have been considered. I'm not aware of that consideration. That would fall into the team composition category. So it might be that depending on the right mix of skill sets and capabilities and timing, that may happen. But that's not something that we don't look at the marital status as a potential buffer. So it certainly, and you'd have to consider how might that impact on the other two members of the crew or other 4 members, depending on what the final crew size might be. Might that create tension when the marital couple goes off and spends time alone versus the other 2 crew member who may not want to be alone at that time? And so it introduces some buffer and it may introduce some stress, and that would all have to be factored in.
And I think we're going to ask one more question, and that is, how are you currently measuring team dynamics and cohesion?
We have, part of that is in the Dingus-In score that I made reference to, and in the exploration measures, we have measures of team cooperation and collaboration and cohesion that are being taken on a regular basis, at least weekly in most cases. We also have team task switching that just finished on station, and we have kind of the ability of the team to interface between mission control, flight directors, and team currently in the queue to be assessed. So we look at it from multiple perspectives. We look at it in our analogs, and we look at it on station with some of our standard measures that are also collected on crew that consent to complete the human research program standard measures. We have some of those measures embedded to assess the team cooperation and cohesion.
And I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up here, and that is, have brain stimulation techniques such as TDCS been explored to counteract brain changes associated with isolation in spaceflight?
Yes, we have a study right now from Dr. McKinley, who's with the Air Force Research Lab, and we funded him about a year ago. We should be getting those results soon. He had done some preliminary work looking at Air Force pilots and using transcranial stimulation to increase attention and vigilance in Air Force pilots. And we looked at that as a really interesting opportunity that may help, like after slam shifts or space fog. So we've got that study undergoing, and we're anxiously awaiting the results of that. And that is an important, that brain-computer interface, and that the opportunity, as we've looked at interesting research with post-stroke, identifying the appropriate pathway. If you can do a stimulation, a post-stroke patient recovers much quicker once that brain pathway has been identified. And if we generalize that to thinking about the areas of the brain that get diminished and the matrix that we were talking about, the potential is there to try to use some of those approaches in post-stroke to reactivate more quickly areas of the brain that may become more diminished in a long-duration space flight. So we need to understand, can we do that safely, and how do we do that appropriately, if at all? And that's what research is designed to do, is to help us assess whether there's the capability and whether there's any potential harm that comes from that as well.
All right, I think we're going to end there. I'd like to thank Dr. Williams for an amazing presentation and Q&A session, and to let you know, certainly there have been multiple attendees who have expressed that, so thank you very much. This has been a great presentation.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to do it, and really appreciate you giving us the opportunity, and thanks to everyone who joined us and took the time out of their busy schedule to share this with us. So thank you.
All right, everyone. So thanks again. And please join us tomorrow, 11 Central, 12 Eastern, in which we'll be hearing from Dr. Jim Picano. We'll be discussing behavioral health and performance flight operational support. So thanks, and we'll see you then.